This right here is my camera bag, but it has a problem, and it's this guy. So this is my filter case. It has my UV filters and my neutral density filters and all that. With that in there, this doesn't reach the magnetic clasp, so this doesn't actually close, and it looks kind of awful. I mean, this filter case holds 6 filters. I don't need all these. I mean, I do, but I don't. Really, I just need 2 filters. So when it comes time to design your product or project, a lot of designs are so common and so basic that you're not really ripping anybody off by taking inspiration from them. And I'm not saying to go out and copy anybody exactly, but you can certainly go online and find examples of similar things and change aspects of it. You know, if you're going to make a case for filters like I am, odds are you're gonna very quickly arrive at the fact that you need something that is basically as small as you can make it, but that still fits the thing that you want it to fit and completely encloses it so that it doesn't damage the glass, get dust all over it, get water all over it. Other than that, there's not much to design. These are a couple of designs that I have come back with. There's this round one. This is actually made for a lens cap. That's why it's open in the front like that. And this one fits like 5 filters, which I would have to modify that aspect of it. No matter what you're designing, odds are you have a problem that you want the thing that you're designing to solve. Now, your problem might just be purely aesthetic. Maybe you wanted a certain color, or a certain shape, or it might be that you want a certain pocket design, a certain closure mechanism, or any number of things. So the way I'm going to design my filter case is to have both of these filters, one in front of the other. There'll be a divider between the two, and then there'll be a lid that'll fold over the top. You'll open that up, and then you can access both filters from the same direction. These are just some examples. In my case, your results are going to be different. You are the person designing the thing, you are the one with the problem to solve, so you have to come up with the solution. One of the main things that I want you to take away from this is that these decisions when you're designing and making something are difficult, but you are more than capable of doing difficult things. Now, this is a hard decision, but they're hard decisions in the short term. They are not hard decisions in the long term. So I want to start this off by saying this is not an exhaustive list. This is what I use and what I like. I'm going to start off with leather types. There's 2 main tannages, vegetable tanned leather and there's chrome tanned leather. The main difference though is going to be in how they function. There's going to be a bit of a price difference. Chrome tanned is usually a little cheaper because it's a lot faster to produce. If you treat the edge to seal the end fibers from moisture and things like that, you're going to be more limited with chrome tanned than you are with veg tanned. Veg tanned, you can use gum trag, you can use toconol, you can just use water, you can use edge paint. From what I hear, chrome tanned, you can only use toconol or edge paint. The main thing though, veg tann's a lot easier to get with no dye, no oil, just completely natural as this piece is here, so you can completely control how water resistant it is, you know, what color it is, everything. Chrome tan usually comes pre-dyed and with oils already added. You can get vegetable tan the same way. The other main difference is with veg tan, you can stamp it, you can put people's initials pretty easy, you can put your logo. Chrome tan is going to be much, much harder in terms of that. The next decision is going to be the thickness of leather. What thickness do you need for what project? There's a lot of charts out there. I recommend going and checking one of those out if you want to know a little bit more about that. So some of the first tools that you're going to need are probably things that you already have. You'll need a surface to cut and do your work on. This can be a kitchen counter, it can be a card table, whatever you have. If you're doing any kind of hammer work on that surface, try to place it over top of the leg so that as much of that force is directed into the ground and thus back into your material. The other thing you might want is something like this, a cutting mat, so that you're not scratching your kitchen counter or whatever table you're working on. Another thing that you can use is just a piece of leather, just a scrap piece of leather. A hard surface like a scrap piece of wood or one of these self-healing cutting mats I prefer, but I use one of these for a punch pad so I don't leave too many of these holes that I've left in my self-healing mat. Next thing you're probably going to want is a pencil. Ideally, you're going to want to make a template so that you can kind of test how things look and how things might fit together. You'll probably also want something to trace your template onto the piece of leather. This is basically a scratch all. So after that, you're gonna probably want a pair of dividers. We'll go into that a little bit when I do the stitching later. You're gonna need a ruler of some kind, something to measure with, something to lay out with, something to cut against. I highly recommend a metal ruler or a square if you want, just like a regular L-shaped framing square. This has cork on the bottom, which is really nice for leather especially. Helps keep this thing from sliding, because when you're cutting along the edge of it, this side pressure that you apply with your blade can push your ruler and have you cut either off of your piece or, worst case, onto your piece. Next thing is going to be something to cut stuff out with. I prefer an X-Acto knife. They come with a very small, very sharp, very thin blade that you can do really tiny and really precise curves with. You can use a pocket knife if you want to. It doesn't really matter, but you're going to need something to cut with. After you cut out, you might do some punching, depending on if you're going to be riveting things together. These you place on the leather and then you hit the back with a hammer. Odds are you probably only need about an 1/8 inch one for most of your rivets and snaps and stuff like that, but the set is so cheap that I'd probably just buy a set if you can. To use your stitching chisels or round punches, you're going to need some kind of hammer. I prefer a soft-faced hammer. These have removable faces, which I am not strong enough to remove, apparently. I prefer this because I can hit the leather itself if I need to help the contact cement glue a little better or flatten the threads, and it doesn't wear out the back end of your tools as fast, because a metal hammer on a metal tool will start to mushroom over the ends of your tools. You're going to want to glue your pieces together usually before you stitch them or do any edge work, so things don't move around on you. The main thing I like about the contact cement is the fact that it dries in like 20 minutes. I do recommend a very well ventilated area. Use a fan to give you like a cross breeze, because this stuff is really not good for you to breathe in. That said, there are some other options. After you glue things together, you're probably going to start into your edge work. The first thing you're going to want is an edge beveler. This makes it so that instead of having sharp 90-degree corners like on this square, you have a little bit of a rounded kind of corner. You can get these in all sorts of different sizes to get a really aggressive rounding, or just very slightly take off that really sharp corner. That's personal preference. Then you're going to be doing some sanding. So the sandpaper that I use is wet dry sandpaper, so you can use this with water. I usually go from about 120 to 240 to 300 or 400, somewhere in there. And then I go to my burnishing with a canvas cloth and some kind of burnishing solution. So you put some of this on, I'll show you later in the video, and then you buff it with basically a piece of canvas. I do recommend something of a very light color, or something that is not dyed, something white or something like that, and something that is lint free. These are two different types of stitching chisels, and I use stitching chisels only. I don't use pricking irons. This is a 4mm spacing on the top here in silver. Down here is a 6mm spacing, so you can see that for the same 6 holes, you're covering a lot more distance. Now that affects the way the stitch looks. What I use for all of my projects is a 4mm spacing with a 0.03 twisted main thread as of right now. Mainly, this is a personal preference thing, so I'll leave a link if you want to learn a little bit more about that and see some examples. If you're using vegetable tan, especially if it's natural and doesn't come already oiled, you're going to want to put some oil on it. My preference is mink oil, but neat's foot oil is also really good. It's a little bit easier to find neat's foot oil. You can find it at like Ace Hardware and places like that. These basically just give a little bit of water resistance to your natural leather, and they also darken it and soften the leather. If you want to dye your leather a different color, if you have natural veg tan or something like that, you are going to probably want to dye. This is the dye that I use. It's Phoebing's Pro Dye. This just happens to be the show brown color. It's an alcohol-based dye, and I can't really speak to any other dyes because I've never used them. And the last thing you're going to need is safety. Get a dust mask if you're generating a lot of dust, maybe a dust filtration system, but at the very, very bare minimum, always wear your safety glasses. I only take these off if I'm drawing something on a piece of paper for a template or something like that. Otherwise, they stay on the whole time. Any will work as long as they are actually rated for impact. And the main things I look for when I'm finding a spot to cut out for my pieces, I'm obviously looking for blemishes, scratches, and things like that that I want to leave out of the piece. One thing that can really help you to see those is to position your light really low so you'll get shadows basically anywhere where there's a dip or a bump or anything like that that you might want to cut out. Try not to let your template move as well. Keep good firm pressure on it because that can really screw you up when you go to cut out the piece and then it's the wrong size because the template moved. A couple other things worth considering when you're laying out your pieces is who is it for and what color is it going to be. So you might be able to use a piece that's got a blemish on it if you're going to dye it black or dark brown or something like that, because it won't show anyways. As far as who it's for, if it's for somebody, you're probably going to want to use a really nice piece of leather, but if it's just for yourself, you might not care. So like this scar here, there's like 2 or 3, maybe 4 scars in this piece that's going to be pretty visible, but it's for me and I like that stuff, so I don't care. You know, if this was for somebody, I would avoid this area and I would move it over here or somewhere where there's not any of that if I was selling this. Another thing as well is if you have a piece that's completely hidden, this, you know, one of these 2 pieces is going to be a divider down in there and you're basically never going to see it. It'd be really hard to see any imperfections, especially at the bottom edge. Some people say that you shouldn't take that approach when it comes to your products and things like that, but if it's something that's not affecting the function and it's not affecting the appearance, I personally include them, mainly because I would rather do that than waste that material or never use it just because it's got a small, you know, bug bite in it or something like that, and it's all the way at the bottom where it's gonna never see the light of day. It just seems wasteful to me. One thing about leather is you want to use a really sharp blade, just like with anything really. When you're applying a lot of pressure on a blade of any kind, no matter what you're doing, never force and always cut away from you. Never force, because when you're forcing, that's when suddenly it goes, and if you're in the way somewhere, you can cut yourself. All right, next we're going to use this edge beveler here to cut just the very edge off of our pieces here. You can also just do this if you don't want to burnish, that's fine too. With burnishing, you kind of seal the end fibers a little bit, so it gives it a little bit of water resistance. Mostly it makes it look nice. So when you're applying oil, I kind of prefer a rag. You can use a brush and stuff like that, but I just prefer the way the rag works. I usually won't go much heavier than this with the leather, or with the oiling, sorry. And there's other top coats you can use. You can use stuff like Resolene and stuff like that, but the main issue I have with Resolene is it leaves a really like glassy, kind of plasticky feel. I just don't like that. I prefer leather to age, and I'd be fine with it getting some water spots because it gives it character. That's kind of the whole appeal of leather for me. Is the natural aspect of it, the blemishes and stuff like that. And you can see in this piece, like these are scars basically that the cow had. The reason why these are darker is because they absorb the oil more, something to do with the way the scar tissue grows. But that's, you know, these weren't real noticeable, but now they are quite noticeable. But for me, what I'm doing and the fact that it's mine, I don't care. So burnishing is basically just sealing the edge. I do a very simple, fast burnish. I start out with 240 grit sandpaper, and I use wet dry sandpaper because for some of it I do use water. For the 400 grit, which is the next grit that I go to, I like to just have a little bit of water on the sandpaper itself, because if you apply it to the leather, you can end up with wet spots on the front. And if you put too much on the sandpaper, it can kind of run onto the front. So I don't go real heavy with it. You'll see that that's already gonna start to seal up the ends, because you can just use water to burnish with if that's all you have, or you don't wanna buy anything. So with Tokonol specifically, you wanna try to keep it off the surface, because it can, especially if you're gonna dye it, it can mess with the way the dye will absorb into the leather, and so it might not dye very evenly. And you don't want a bunch, you just want a little bit on there. Tokonol, you let it get a little bit dry, basically slightly tacky, And for the actual burnishing, which is what I'm doing right now, you don't need to be super aggressive about it. It's more about the friction and the heat than it is about the pressure. It doesn't take a whole lot. You'll feel it kind of start to get glassy. You can see that's sealed up a little bit compared to, so it's quite a difference aesthetically. So if you're dyeing, I wear gloves just because I don't like getting it all over my hands. It gets on everything. This is another reason why we oil the leather. It actually makes the dye much more even, and that's why you generally want to thin the dye, is because you can kind of sneak up on the color a little bit. If you just use the straight dye, it can be kind of difficult to get maybe the color that you want. It might be basically black with a little bit of the color that you want. So that's why I dilute it. I dilute about 50-50. I've also found that a sponge works kind of the best. It gives me the most even coverage with the least amount of streakiness. And then you leave these to fully dry. That will be dependent on what dye you use. All right, so next we're gonna prep for the stitching. The first thing you wanna do so that you get a nice even stitch is set a pair of dividers. It's like a compass with like a pencil, but it just doesn't have the pencil. So for most projects, I have mine set to about 1/8 of an inch. But for this one, because I'm doing a different kind of stitch, I need a much tighter offset. Basically what you're going to want to find if you're a beginner is probably a set of stitching chisels or stitching punches. This punches 3 holes at a time. You'll punch 4 and then you'll go into the previous hole so that you're using that to kind of blend the next set of holes. What I'll often do is I'll start where I want to and I'll make a little dot, and then so I kind of rock the tool and make a little mark and see if that ends up in the same spot, which in this case it does not. You're probably not able to see it, but this hole is, if I'm gonna exaggerate, way down here, and this hole is way up here. So you can see how like it would look even and symmetrical. So basically all I'm going to do is eyeball about half that distance, and I'm gonna start my first hole there and then work around. If it's not that close, that's what this single punch is for. So you can put that hole where it looks even though it might not be actually even. You want to keep the tool nice and square to the work surface, because if you angle it like this, even though the leather is quite thin, you're going to end up with the holes in a different location on the backside. This stitch that I'm going to do is not a typical stitch, so I'm not really going to go into detail on the stitch itself. It's still kind of a saddle stitch, which is what your odds are going to want to use, but it's not quite the same. So I'm not going to go into detail. There's a lot of good videos, and I'll leave a link in the description to one of them. There's a bunch of different glues you can use. I'm trying out a couple of new ones that are water-based. It's not very good to breathe in wood weld and some of those other glues. I'm trying out this one, which is from Siwa. It's the same company that makes Tokonol. There's also Renia 315 that I'm trying out. All the contact glues that I've used, you apply it to both surfaces, let it dry until it's tacky, and then you stick the 2 pieces together, and it bonds pretty much instantly. It's really helpful, especially for stitching, because you can glue it and it dries well enough, quick enough that you can stitch pieces together. If you're applying it to the front, like the skin side of leather, you want to scratch that surface a little bit before you apply it, just to give it a little bit of extra grip. And you'll also kind of want to avoid oiling the areas that you're going to glue, because the oil can prevent the glue from sticking as well. All right, so now it's pretty much just a normal saddle stitch, except that I'm going to be taking the needle and going through at an angle. So going through the face of this and coming out of the face of this. That's why punch those holes at an angle in this piece so that I can hopefully do that. Normally I oil again after I dye because I've found that the leather kind of dries up a little bit, and I forgot to do that this time, so I'm just going to do it now that I've assembled everything. Ideally you would do this before everything's put together because it's just a little easier to get to everything. What you saw me do before I stamped the logo on there as well is called casing the leather. If you do any kind of stamping, it's going to make the stamp a lot more defined. You want to dampen the leather, you don't want to soak it or anything like that, but you want it to be very even because otherwise you can end up with water spots. So if there's nothing else that you take away from this video, I want you to take away this. No matter how good you are at something, you are going to make mistakes. It is inevitable. As you get better at something, you will also get better at identifying mistakes. You will make less mistakes as you get better, and you will get better at recognizing them before they happen and preventing them, but you will also get better at recognizing smaller and smaller mistakes that you wouldn't have recognized when you were a beginner. I'm going to go through a few of the mistakes that I made with this case. The main one being I left this a little bit wide of the filter so that I could get my fingers on either side to pull the filter out, and I can, but just barely. The main issue with that is this width here from the divider piece to my back piece. It's not wide enough for me to get my fingers in there. If I had known that that was going to be the case, which I didn't, of course, then I would have just made the whole case a little bit narrower to save space and material. What I'll basically do now is just grab by the metal ring and pull the filter out that way, which works just fine. The other issue, when you go to close the case, you push on this, that pushes on the stud, and the back of the stud here presses against the glass of my filter. I'm gonna fix that by gluing a piece of leather on the back side. If I had seen it coming, I would have maybe made a more aesthetic fix for that issue than just gluing a little patch piece in there. You see how nice these stitches on this side here look? They're all even and consistent here in the middle. On this side, that is the melted end of the thread. Now that you can't avoid, you have to melt the end of the thread, because usually what you'll do is you'll cut the threads off, you'll take a lighter and you'll melt the thread so that the thread can't back itself out of the hole and undo your stitch. What I should have done is what I did on the other side after I thought about it a little bit and melted it on the inside where you basically won't see it anyways. Now the next thing is this kind of joint that I did. I wanted it to be 90 degrees like this. If I had had my stitches inset a little bit further, this front and back piece here would have kind of hung past like that. I didn't want that look, so I put my stitch holes really close to the edge, and that combined with me pulling a little bit too hard on the stitches has caused a few of the threads to pull through the stitches, including one up here at the top. We'll see how it holds up. Hopefully it'll be fine, but worst case scenario, I make a new one. No matter how beginner you are or how much of a master you are, you're gonna make mistakes. Most of the time they're gonna be aesthetic mistakes. Sometimes they're gonna be functional mistakes. Functional mistakes might require you to make the thing again, and that's okay. If it doesn't suit your needs, make another one. And I promise you it'll be way better than the first one. For this case, I'm gonna leave it how it is. It fulfills the main purpose that I wanted it to, which is that it's about half the size of my old filter case. And again, you are going to make mistakes. And that's okay, because making stuff is hard, but you are more than capable of doing difficult things.